The stretch of the Mississippi River that flows through East Baton Rouge Parish, Louisiana, possesses a majestic and generous beauty characteristic of the American South. For generations, the river has been a friend, a source of life, and a commercial artery for countless families along its banks. Their lives flowed peacefully with the current, marked by early mornings casting nets and late afternoons untangling them in the twilight glow. Mr. Beau Landry, a fisherman in his late 60s with skin weathered dark by the sun and wind, had tied his entire life to this river. He knew every bend, every channel, and every high tide by heart, but he could never have imagined that on one fateful morning, the mother river he so loved would deliver him the most horrifying gift of his life. It was a morning in late July 2025. As usual, Mr. Beau paddled his small John boat out to the middle of the river alone to pull in the nets he had set the night before. The first haul was quite heavy, promising a bountiful day. But when he got to the last net, in a fairly deserted stretch of the river where a swirling eddy was rumoured to be incredibly deep, he felt an unusual weight. The net seemed to have snagged on something enormous lying still at the bottom. Annoyed, he braced himself and pulled with all his might, but the net wouldn't budge. His small boat rocked as if it were about to capsize. Thinking the net had caught on a submerged ancient tree trunk or a large rock, Mr. Beau decided to anchor the boat, then tore off his shirt, took a deep breath, and dived down to free it. The water here was quite deep and murky, reddish-brown with silt, but with the experience of a riverman, he quickly found the spot where the net was stuck. His hands fumbled along the net and touched a large, smooth metal object, slippery with green moss. Curious, he dived deeper, trying to open his eyes wide to see clearly. At the riverbed, partially buried in sand and mud, were not one but two iron barrels, one large and one small, rusted and covered in barnacles. His net was tightly wrapped around the smaller barrel. After a struggle, Mr. Beau managed to free the net. But as he surfaced for air, his curiosity overcame any intention of leaving. Where did these two barrels come from? Why were they dumped here? And what was inside that made them so heavy? The instinct of a man who had spent his entire life on the river told him something was wrong. He decided he had to find a way to get them ashore. The large barrel was too heavy, he couldn't move it alone. But the smaller one, though also very heavy, he thought he could manage. He paddled his boat to the bank, grabbed his strongest ropes, and went back out. He dived again, tying the rope securely around the small barrel. It was an incredibly arduous task. He had to use all his strength, pulling and shouting, using the water's buoyancy to inch it, painstakingly, onto a riverside sandbar. The iron barrel, having likely been submerged for many years, was severely corroded and rusted. Many spots on its body had rotted away, revealing patches of grey, rock-hard concrete inside. Mr. Beau couldn't understand why someone would fill a barrel with concrete and dump it in the river like this. Perhaps a homemade anchor from some barge? He used a large rock to smash a rusty spot on the barrel side. The thin iron shell broke away, revealing a larger piece of concrete. But something made Mr. Beau stop. Through the newly created hole, he saw something that wasn't concrete. It was pink, looking like a piece of faded fabric. Curious, he continued to strike the hole harder, repeatedly. The hole grew larger. And then, a horrific scene unfolded, causing the old fisherman, a man of the water his whole life, to let out a blood-curdling scream and fall to the ground, his face drained of all colour. Through the rusty metal and the jagged concrete, he could faintly see a few small, white bones, shaped like ribs. And that pink fabric was part of a child's dress, a pretty pink dress. A child's ribs and a pink dress, cast in a block of concrete. Utter fear enveloped Mr. Beau. He trembled, scrambled backward, then ran for his life toward the village, shouting incessantly that there was a body in the river, a body in a concrete barrel. The news was quickly reported to the local sheriff's office, then escalated to the East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's Office and the Louisiana State Police. Within an hour, criminal investigators and tactical units were on the scene, securing the entire section of the river where the barrel was discovered. Identifying this as a particularly serious homicide case, a special task force was immediately formed, led by Detective Michael Chen, a young but incredibly sharp and decisive investigator from the State Police's Criminal Investigations Division. The first and most urgent task was to recover the remaining large barrel from the riverbed. A search and rescue team with specialized equipment was dispatched. After many hours of tense work, the second, much heavier barrel was also brought ashore. At the scene, in the presence of a representative from the district attorney's office, the forensic team used sledgehammers and specialized tools to break open the two concrete blocks, a laborious and haunting task. The sound of hammers striking concrete echoed sharply in the quiet evening air by the river, like a call to a tormented soul. As the solid concrete broke apart, two sets of skeletal remains, almost completely decomposed but still intact within their molds, were revealed. Inside the small concrete block, just as Mr. Bowe had seen, were the skeletal remains of a little girl wearing a pink dress, estimated to be between 6 and 8 years old. In the larger block were the skeletal remains of an adult male. Two concrete blocks, two nameless graves, pulled from the river bottom after years submerged in darkness. The killer had used the most cruel and cunning method of disposal, a method they believed would seal their crime forever. But the net of justice is vast no matter how well hidden. A crime will one day be brought to light. A challenging investigation began. With two unidentified skeletons murdered years ago, the task force faced an almost unsolvable puzzle. They had no victim identities, no suspects, and no motive. Their only clue was a faded pink dress and the belief that justice must be served. The first and most arduous task was to turn back the clock, to search the vast archives of law enforcement for a missing persons case involving a father and a young daughter, a case that had perhaps been long forgotten. The hunt for ghosts began. The examination of the two skeletons was carried out urgently at the State Forensic Science Center. This was a haunting task that required absolute precision. Forensic examiners and forensic anthropologists, with the utmost care, spent days analyzing every minute detail, trying to force the nameless bones to tell their story. The initial autopsy report provided crucial information for the task force. Based on bone development and dental structure, they determined the body in the large barrel was a male, aged between 30 and 35 at the time of death. The body in the small barrel was a girl, aged between 6 and 8. The estimated height of the man was about 5 feet 7 inches, and the girl was about 3 feet 11 inches. More importantly, the examination confirmed one of Detective Michael Chen's major suspicions. There were no signs of external force on either skeleton, such as stabbing, cutting, or broken bones from a struggle. This almost ruled out the possibility that they were killed by physical violence. In a task force meeting, Detective Chen stated that this was very likely a case of murder by poison. He reasoned that the perpetrator chose a silent method of execution, which explained why they had enough time and composure to carry out such a complex and gruesome body disposal. A request for in-depth toxicology tests on the remaining bone marrow samples was made. However, forensic experts also warned that after being submerged in water and decomposing for 5 years, the chance of finding any residual poison was extremely low. While awaiting results from the lab, another crucial and arduous line of investigation was launched, to review all missing persons files in East Baton Rouge Parish and neighboring parishes from 5 years ago, between 2019 and 2021. This was an incredibly tedious and demanding job. Thousands of old, dust-covered files had to be re-examined. Investigators worked day and night in the archives, their eyes glued to each page, searching for a specific case, a father and a young daughter who had disappeared together. Weeks passed. Hundreds of cases were reviewed and dismissed. Fatigue and pressure mounted on the officers. It seemed this path, too, would lead to a dead end, much like the fate of the two victims at the bottom of the river. But then one afternoon, a young, sleep-deprived investigator found a noteworthy file, a file that had been neglected for 5 years. The report was filed in late July 2020 with the East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's Office, the very jurisdiction where the barrels were found. The reporting person was a woman named Catherine Miller. The report was about her husband, John Miller, then 32, and their daughter, Emily Miller, 7, who had suddenly left the area. According to Catherine's statement at the time, her husband said he had a great job opportunity in the Texas oil fields. He had decided to take their daughter with him for easier care and to start a new life, promising to send money back and have his wife join them once he was settled. She even provided the police with a few text messages, supposedly from her husband, sent in the early days, saying that the two of them had arrived safely and that life was good. But after a few months, she said, she had completely lost contact. She appeared extremely worried, fearing that her husband and daughter had met with foul play in a strange new place. The case at the time, with the text messages as evidence and the wife's plausible story, was processed as a routine missing persons case. With no new details or signs of a criminal offense, the file was gradually shelved and faded into obscurity. The astonishing match in age and gender between the father and daughter in this file and the two skeletons found immediately caught the task force's attention. They promptly launched a deeper investigation into this family. At the same time, good news arrived from the forensic lab. Although they couldn't identify the specific type of poison, advanced tests had detected unusual traces of certain heavy metals in the bone samples of both victims, further strengthening the poisoning hypothesis. With no doubt left, the task force immediately went to John Miller's hometown to meet his elderly parents and collect DNA samples. The final DNA results came back a few days later. The DNA from the two skeletons was a perfect match with the grandparents' DNA, confirming the biological relationship of father-daughter and grandparents-grandchild. The two bodies in the concrete blocks were indeed John Miller and his daughter, Emily Miller. The hunt for the ghosts was over. Now, the missing persons case had officially become a double homicide case of a particularly gruesome nature. And the prime suspect was none other than the wife and mother who had reported them missing 5 years ago, Catherine Miller. The story she told the police back then had now become an elaborate lie, staged to conceal her crime. The task force's next mission was to find out where Catherine Miller was. 5 years is a long time, enough for someone to erase all traces and start a new life. Detectives began to track Catherine's movements from the time she left the parish. They discovered that just about 6 months after reporting her husband and child missing, Catherine Miller had sold the family's entire house, land, and property. Then she disappeared from the area. The search for this woman began, and investigators didn't take long. Using the National Resident Database, they quickly pinpointed Catherine's new location. She hadn't gone far. She was living in New Orleans, just over 60 miles from the old crime scene. And more importantly, she wasn't living alone. She was living with another man as husband and wife. Who was this man? Was he connected to the case? A surveillance team was immediately sent to New Orleans to investigate. While waiting for information from the New Orleans team, Detective Michael Chen sat alone in his office, trying to piece the events together. A wife poisons her husband and her own daughter, then calmly fabricates a disappearance story and sells all their assets to be with her lover. The motive seemed crystal clear. But was it really that simple? What role did Catherine's new lover play in this brutal plan? The case still held many mysteries. But now, the task force had its primary target. The investigation was only just beginning. With the victims' identities and the prime suspect established, the task force's investigative machinery kicked into high gear. The mission to track down Catherine Miller and her mysterious lover was launched with urgency. It didn't take long for detectives to pinpoint Catherine's current residence. After selling all her property in East Baton Rouge Parish in late 2020, she and a man had moved to a new residential area in the Algiers district of New Orleans. A special team, led by a deputy chief of criminal investigations, was immediately dispatched. In New Orleans, coordinating with a local police department, the detectives quickly set up a covert surveillance perimeter around the house where Catherine was living. It was a rather nice 2-story house. Every day, Catherine lived the life of a normal housewife, going to the market, cooking, and cleaning the house. The man living with her was also quickly identified. His name was David Russo, 38, a construction worker. To gather more evidence, another investigative team returned to the Millers' old neighborhood, reviewing all records of construction and repairs done on John and Catherine Miller's house 5 years prior. A key detail was discovered. David Russo, the man currently living with Catherine Miller in New Orleans, was the foreman of the construction crew John Miller had hired to renovate the kitchen and build an extension. The time this crew worked at the Miller's house perfectly coincided with the period just before the father and daughter disappeared. The connection was clear. David Russo wasn't a new lover Catherine met after her husband vanished. He had been there before, and their illicit affair had likely blossomed right under the victim's roof. Russo was not just a lover, he was almost certainly an accomplice in the crime. After gathering enough initial evidence, Detective Michael Chen decided it was time to act. A plan for simultaneous arrests was drawn up to prevent the two suspects from colluding or fleeing. Early one morning, 2 teams moved in at once. One team arrested Catherine Miller at her home in New Orleans. The other, based on surveillance information, arrested David Russo while he was working at a construction site in the central business district. Both were completely stunned, unable to believe that after 5 years of peaceful living, their crime could be exposed. They were quickly transported separately back to the Louisiana State Police headquarters for interrogation. In the interrogation rooms, 2 tense battles of wits began. Detective Chen personally questioned Catherine Miller. Facing the investigators, the woman appeared incredibly calm and cunning. She continued to play the part of a pitiful wife. With tear-filled eyes, she insisted that the story she told 5 years ago was the truth. Her husband and daughter had left for Texas. She claimed to have waited 5 years for him and portrayed David as merely a kind man who helped her through painful days, insisting he had nothing to do with the situation. Catherine's performance was flawless, but Detective Chen was not easily fooled. He knew that with a subject as psychologically steadfast and prepared as Catherine, who had had 5 years to rehearse, only hard evidence could break her facade. Meanwhile, in the adjacent interrogation room, David Russo exhibited completely different behavior. The construction worker looked tough, but his constantly shifting eyes betrayed his anxiety and fear. Initially, he also denied the crime, claiming he had only met Catherine a few years ago. But Russo did not have the psychological fortitude of his lover. The investigators decided to attack this weaker link. They applied a classic police tactic, breaking the criminal alliance. An investigator authoritatively told David that Catherine had already confessed everything and was trying to push all the blame onto him. He relayed her supposed story. David was the mastermind who seduced her, planned the murder to seize their property, carried out the poisoning, and forced her to help. The investigator pointed out she was trying to get a lenient sentence by pinning it all on him, then asked if he wanted to take the fall for 2 murders alone. This psychological blow struck at David Russo's greatest fear. The fear of being betrayed by his lover, of being made the scapegoat for a crime carrying the death penalty, was greater than his obstinacy. He knew Catherine's nature well, a woman who would do anything for herself. He believed it was entirely possible for Catherine to sell him out to save herself. Silence was no longer golden. He decided he had to tell the truth to save his own skin. His feigned composure shattering, Russo shouted that it wasn't him, that it was all her. And then, he began to confess. Russo's confession laid bare the entire horrific truth of 5 years ago, a truth even more brutal than the task force had imagined. He admitted the illicit relationship with Catherine began when he came to work on her house. He said it was Catherine who had actively seduced him. Mesmerized by her beauty and flirtatiousness, he had plunged into the sinful affair. Catherine constantly complained to him about her dull marriage and her gentle but weak-willed husband. He said Catherine craved a life of freedom, and he was her way out. But when Catherine suggested a divorce, she was met with fierce opposition from both families. They threatened not to give her a single penny and to fight for custody of Emily. Russo confessed, his voice trembling. That was when she changed. He recounted how she told him that if they couldn't leave openly, they had to find another way. She had described her husband and daughter as 2 cages trapping her, saying that if she wanted to be free, she had to break those cages. Russo admitted that Catherine was the one who masterminded the entire murder plot. Blinded by love and the prospect of owning a large property, he had agreed to go along with it. It was Catherine who thought of using poison, and it was Russo who supplied it and later, with his lover, carried out the gruesome act of disposing of the bodies. David Russo's confession was recorded in detail. He signed every page of the statement. The case now had its first confession, a direct testimony accusing the true mastermind. Detective Michael Chen held the file containing Russo's confession. He walked toward the interrogation room where Catherine Miller was still being held. He opened the door and placed the file on the table right in front of the woman. He told Catherine they had a full confession from David Russo. He laid out the details Russo had provided, from their illicit affair to the plan to buy poison and the night they mixed concrete to dispose of the bodies. He finished by stating that Russo named her as the mastermind and that her act was over. Catherine Miller looked at the file, then up at Detective Chen, her face as white as a sheet. The perfect act she had maintained for 5 long years had finally come to an end. In the interrogation room at the Louisiana State Police headquarters, Catherine Miller sat motionless. The file containing David Russo's confession lay on the table like an irrefutable indictment, completely shattering the wall of lies she had painstakingly built for 5 years. When confronted with the detailed testimony of her lover, the man she believed would bury this secret with her forever, Catherine Miller's feigned composure finally crumbled. But instead of panic or fear, Her reaction was one of cold fury, a hatred for the accomplice who had betrayed her. She hissed that he was a coward, saying he promised to live or die with her but was now blaming it all on her. Seeing that the subject had lost her composure, Detective Michael Chen knew it was time for the whole truth to be revealed. He didn't need to press her further. It was her own anger and desire to expose the traitor that made Catherine Miller confess everything herself. Her confession was a horrifying story of human depravity, of how selfishness and lust can turn a wife and a mother into a monster. She admitted that the entire plan was her idea. She spoke of a marriage she considered dull, of a husband so gentle he was weak. She craved a more exciting life, a more passionate love, and David Russo, the construction worker with his sweet talk, gave her exactly what she needed. When their secret affair was discovered and opposed by both families, instead of stopping, her resentment grew. She saw her husband and even her own little daughter as obstacles, cages imprisoning her happiness and freedom. She recounted coldly what she had told her lover, that John and the kid were the cage locking her in, and if you can't open the cage, you have to break it. It was she who came up with the idea of using poison, believing it to be a clean method that would be difficult to detect. She had deceived her husband, telling him there were many rats destroying their garden, to get money from him to buy a potent rat poison. That poison, instead of being used on rats, became the weapon to kill her own husband and daughter. She recounted their last dinner together with chilling, emotionless detail. She had personally cooked a fish stew that both her husband and daughter loved, and then silently poured the entire packet of poison into the pot. She served the food to her husband and daughter and then sat there, silently watching the two people she should have loved most slowly slip away in agony. Unable to contain his outrage, an investigator interrupted, asking why she could do it to Emily, her own daughter. Catherine Miller looked up, stared directly at the investigator, and gave an answer that sent a chill through the entire room with its cold-bloodedness. She explained that Emily had to die too, because if left behind, she would eventually ask where her dad was and would grow up to resent her. She was, Catherine stated, a nuisance. The 7-year-old girl, in this woman's twisted mind, was just a nuisance that needed to be eliminated to clear the path for her new life. After John and Emily were dead, she called Russo over. Together, under the cover of darkness, they carried out the final stage of their plan. They dragged the two bodies to the backyard, placing them in the 2 barrels Russo had prepared. Then the construction worker, with his professional experience, calmly mixed cement, sand, and stone, creating a deadly mortar, and filled the 2 barrels, turning them into 2 permanent concrete tombs. At dawn, they used a utility truck to transport the 2 accursed concrete blocks to a secluded spot on the river and push them into the deep water. The confessions of the 2 perpetrators closed the case entirely. Their heinous crimes sparked extreme outrage among the public. People were not only angered by the cruelty of the couple but also deeply saddened by the fate of the father and daughter. At the subsequent trial, faced with irrefutable evidence and the confessions of both, the District Court of East Baton Rouge Parish delivered the strictest possible sentence. The jury found the defendant's actions to be particularly egregious, taking the lives of 2 people, including a child, with a despicable motive and an incredibly cruel, barbaric, and inhuman method. For her role as the mastermind who directly poisoned her husband and her own daughter, the defendant Catherine Miller received the highest sentence, death. The defendant David Russo, for his role as an active accomplice in planning and directly carrying out the gruesome disposal of the bodies, also received a commensurate sentence, death. The death sentences for both were widely supported by the public. But beyond the severity of the law, this case leaves behind a painful silence and prompts somber reflection. Through this case, we see that an illicit love is like an acid. It corrodes not only reason but also humanity. It can turn a wife, a mother, into a monster willing to kill her own loved ones just to satisfy her personal desires. It shows that when morality is placed below selfishness, any horrific crime can happen. The 2 perpetrators believed that the 2 cold concrete blocks would seal their crime forever at the bottom of the deep river. But they were wrong. Time can rust an iron shell, but it cannot erode a crime. And justice sometimes arrives through the most coincidental of events, like a fisherman's net, to pull the truth into the light. And perhaps the most haunting thing in this case is not the cruelty of the killer, but the image of the pink dress found inside the concrete block. It is a symbol of innocence that was brutally buried by the hands of her own mother.